Fiscal Policy. Okay, what is fiscal policy? Well, the word fiscal means budget. It has a Latin root that ties to that word. So we have the fiscal year, which is the budget year, and we have fiscal policy, which is budget policy. Generally speaking, though, we only apply fiscal policy to federal government use of budget and taxes, not to states and local governments. So fiscal policy technically is the use of the government's taxing and spending powers to influence the economy. So we're using our ability to tax and our ability to spend to change things about economic activity. We should mention that in the United States, there's something called the Employment Act of 1946 that says it's the government's job to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. It says that, okay? So the law of the United States of America is that the government is supposed to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power, which is another way of saying, minimum unemployment, maximum jobs, no inflation, that kind of thing. It doesn't say how the government's supposed to do it. It just says the government is supposed to do it, okay? So one of the ways the government's going to do it is through fiscal policy. And it has two broad categories of tools. And we'll talk about individual stuff here in a minute, but it has two broad categories of tools. One of these categories is called automatic stabilizers. An automatic stabilizer is something that happens automatically, which should make sense, right? So big recession comes, lots of people get laid off, the government pays them unemployment insurance. And if their unemployment insurance runs out, there's all sorts of other government programs they qualify for. Those happen automatically. The government doesn't have to pass a law every time somebody gets laid off or fired to get them unemployment. Okay? Happens automatically. The tax system adjusts to things automatically. So we have tax brackets, and when your income gets cut, you get kicked down into a lower tax bracket. That tax bracket can help minimize the effect on your income, the fact that you're in a lower tax bracket. Okay? So we have these things the government puts in place that happen automatically, spending that happens automatically. Beyond that, we have what are called discretionary tools or discretionary spending tools that the government has. So a recession comes, the government can throw money at building roads or bridges, or it can give the military money to build some ships and planes and stuff. And by doing that, by spending that money, then the government might be able to create jobs, right? It's the Great Depression. You build Hoover Dam, you create jobs for people who live in southern Nevada. Okay? But that's discretionary. It doesn't happen unless Congress decides that it's going to do something. All right? So how big is government? Well, since World War II, federal spending is about 2/3 of all government spending, and state and local spending is about 1/3. Before, if you go back in history, the federal government tended to be fairly small, and then between World War I and World War II, there's a run-up in the size of the federal government, and it's been about 2/3, 1/3 since World War II. Total, the federal government is about 20% of GDP. That means that in total, government is about 1/3 of GDP. So about 1/3 of what happens in the United States is government, federal, state, and local. Remember, we have a federal system. That means there's one central government, one federal government. There's 50 state governments. There's 3,000 I'm rounding this part off. There's 3,000-ish counties. There's 25,000 cities. There's about 25,000 school districts. There's all this stuff out there. Okay? Over time, though, we've had a change in what we spend our money on, and over time we spend more and more money on retirement programs like Social Security or federal retirement things. Healthcare, because we have Medicare, we have Obamacare, we have veterans system. Okay, we have lots of federally funded healthcare. Medicaid that the states do is partly funded by the federal government. And then, of course, we increasingly have to pay interest on our debts. Okay. So here's federal spending, and this is a couple years old, but it's still close enough. On the right-hand side, you have the big green slice, which is about half of all federal spending, and it says transfer payments. A transfer payment is when we take money from one person and give that money to another person. We have transferred it. The government doesn't actually buy anything. So working people pay their Social Security tax into the fund. Social Security Administration pays retirees their Social Security checks. That's a transfer payment, right? Money that comes from one group of people through their taxes and then is paid out to another group of people. And that's half of all federal government spending is transfer payments. Okay. Defense, 17%. Giving money to state and local governments is 13%. And that's interesting, of course, because what's happened, you may have noticed that cost of going to college has gone way up and tuition has gone way up. Well, that's because state governments throw less and less and less money into higher education every year. So what's happened as a society is states have done two things, and it's not necessarily good or bad. You have to make those judgments yourself, right? Where we want to be positive economists, and that doesn't mean happy. That means, again, we want to tell the story without editorializing about whether it's good or bad. But incentives matter, right? And as the federal government made itself more and more willing to fund education, higher education, by putting in scholarship programs and Pell Grants and all that kind of stuff, as there's more and more federal financial aid, the states went, hey, why are we paying for higher ed if we can get the feds to pay for it? So by cutting the state part of funding for higher ed, by increasing the student fees part of higher ed, what they've done is transfer a big chunk of the expenses that they were spending on higher education to the federal government. Now, some students can't attach themselves to that federal pipeline of money, and so they're going to pay more for their education, where other students are able to get a lot of that federal money and don't have to pay so much. But either way, the state has passed a significant percentage of the costs of higher education onto the students in the federal government. All right? And you haven't seen a lot of yelling by anybody except for the college students about that, right? Taxpayers in those states are happy that their taxes don't have to go up, and they don't maybe think about it being that higher education is getting more expensive for the student, and that's keeping their taxes from going up. But that's what's happening. Okay. Then we get interest payments, which is 12.2, which is a lot of money. And then all the rest of everything else the federal government does is only 8%. So when people say, we could get rid of all that, it wouldn't make that big a difference, right? It just wouldn't make that big a difference, okay? 2020 is the middle of when I'm recording this. One of the issues that's going to be in the presidential campaign is that President Trump wants to get the federal budget under control. Well, really, the only way he's got to do that is obvious from this screen is to cut Social Security and Medicare, to cut some of the transfer payments that are on that in that green box. That's the easiest way to get control of federal spending. Okay, is to go after Social Security and Medicare. And so Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House before Nancy Pelosi, he put together a plan to cut Social Security and Medicare, which didn't get passed. And if the Republicans win the presidency and get back control of Congress in 2020, then you would expect them to see attempts to cut Social Security and Medicare. Okay? And again, the transfer payments are half of federal spending. And so if you're really going to attack federal spending, you either have to attack the grants to state and local governments or defense or transfer payments. That's where the money is, right? So which to go after. All right, where does the federal government get its money? Well, it gets it from the citizens of the country, okay? The individual income tax, 46%, and Social Security tax, 38%. So you and me, working people, we pay 84% of all the federal taxes, okay? People who work, have jobs, make money, individual income taxes. Corporate income taxes are only 4.5%. They used to be more, now they're only 4.5%. And all other taxes and revenues are 11%. Remember, I think we talked about this once before, but if we didn't, we should have. I'm pretty sure we did. That if we go back before World War I, tariffs are the way the government funds itself. So tariffs are only not even 1% of federal tax revenues most years. Today, and you think about if tariffs are $50 billion, which they are, as was tariff collections, that's not much of a federal government with the $1 trillion that we're spending. So we're spending, right? Yeah, we're spending, 20, yeah, a lot. Okay? All right. So Social Security and Medicare. Social Security is a product of the Great Depression. Medicare is a product of the 1960s. How do we pay for them? Let's be clear. Some people think that what happens is you pay into Social Security and pay into Medicare, and somehow they put that money away for you. That is not how the system works. You pay your money in, and you are funding the people now who are getting the benefits. Most years, the federal government takes any extra money that's in Social Security and Medicare and goes and spends it on paper clips and airplanes and all that other stuff they want to spend it on. When Al Gore was running for president in 2000, so 20 years ago, he said what we should do is have a Social Security lockbox. And all that extra money that gets paid in, instead of taking it and giving it to the federal government just to spend, we hold it and invest it somewhere and put it away so that when people get ready for retire, that money is actually there. Okay? So that's not what happens. And really, the Social Security Administration owns federal bonds, but that's just the taxpayers have to come up with that. When Social Security started, there were something like 13 people paying in for every person on Social Security. And so taxes didn't have to be that high, and people got their Social Security payment. When we hit the worst part of this, which is maybe 15 years away when we get to the most financially troubling part of Social Security, we're going to have less than 2 people paying in for every person who's collecting. Okay? Which probably means the federal government's going to have to borrow lots and lots and lots of money to cover Social Security payments. Okay? And the government hasn't helped themselves. How long have we known there's a problem? Jimmy Carter did a study in the 70s that showed that Social Security was going to go bankrupt. Okay? We've changed things a little bit, but not very much. And then we made things worse. So, for example, when President Bush was president, the W. Bush, Congress enacted the Medicare Part D, which is the drug benefit in Medicare, and they didn't pay for it. They just enacted it and said, we're going to spend this money, billions of dollars every year, like $50 billion a year. They didn't pay for it. They just started paying out without bringing any money in. Okay, so it's solvent till that 2031-ish. The way we live a lot longer than we used to. When Social Security started, Americans lived, if you made it to 65, you might make it to 70 on average, but that's it. Now, if you make it to 65, you're going to make it well into your 80s. The system, we haven't really changed the retirement age, right? We haven't said, look, nobody can retire until 70 instead of 65. To get Social Security, if you're old, if you're getting up to the point of collecting it now, instead of collecting at 65, you might have to collect at 66, right? They've pushed it out a little bit, but they haven't made any changes. That's the easiest way to cut Social Security is to make people work a couple years longer. That way you get more income, and over their lifetime, they're going to have less payments to them. That's the easiest way, but that's politically not popular, and it should have been done a long time ago. In other words, when Jimmy Carter was president in the 70s, you could have started attacking and say, okay, 30 years from now, we're going to go to 66 and then 66. And it would have already been in place, and now it would be happening and people would be mad. But you can't blame Jimmy Carter because he's old. Right? But we didn't do that. Okay? And again, we've known about this from the 70s. We've known that Social Security and Medicare were in financial trouble since the 70s and really haven't acted. And every president since then has said, yeah, there's a problem, we got to do something, and then hasn't really dealt.